Okay, so we have a ton of ideas when it comes to trying to figure out different types of challenges or new and unique ways to play through already existing Halo titles, and one that really intrigued us for a long time definitely was the topic of trying to complete a Halo game without walking. Now, if you remember all the way back, we did manage to complete Halo 2 without walking, utilizing various skulls to launch ourselves up into the air with grenades and to try to kind of land without falling to our death and make our way through Halo 2. It was really challenging to even progress in that, and it made for a really fun video. Then we did it again with Halo Reach, this time without having the same array of skulls that Halo 2 had, and it was this really tedious process of throwing grenades at our feet and just moving a foot at a time or dying and respawning in any direction. Now, this was something we were really interested in trying to do on Halo 3, but Halo 3 has always, since we've tested this well over a year ago, posed a major problem to the possibility or viability of this even being completable. Essentially, when it comes to the tricks that we were able to use in Halo 2 and Halo Reach, they straight up just don't really work here. We did think at first that throwing grenades would give us a little bit of a boost to progress us through, and what we learned was with Halo 3, a lot of the times the grenade will not push a player at all, just kind of bounce them up and right back down in the same place. So this was actually something that we had tried and spent a couple of hours on, just trying to figure out if there was any options for us to move and progress in Halo 3 without walking at all, and we kind of felt like there wasn't any real viable way to make this happen. That was until we were doing one of our other challenges, and I somewhere along the way realized that if you jump at the peak of a grenade throw exploding right under you, some of the time you may get a slight movement in a certain direction, and sometimes it's literally the slightest inch, but it's still movement nonetheless, which did make me wonder, if we played around with this more, could we find a viable solution to this challenge that we had deemed impossible over a year ago, and maybe revive this challenge as something we can attempt to do. Hey, real quick, before we go further into this video, we actually don't have a sponsor lined up today. So instead, if you like our videos, specifically the background music that's in our videos, you can check out our album Future Payphones for free on all streaming devices and for download in our website. And if you want to use the music in your own YouTube videos, you can purchase a license and directly support Luke and I making these videos in the process. Or if you just want to support Luke and I and get the album that I'm incredibly proud of, plus 14 bonus tracks, it really would help Luke and I out a lot with making content. Luke and I are just taking the revenue from whatever we make, and we're straight up just splitting it 50-50. So if that sounds cool, check out that option, or you can always just listen and follow on literally any streaming service. Okay, let's go ahead and get back into this video. So I jumped on with Luke and Dim, and we actually ended up streaming our attempts the first night of this, where we started things up on Sierra 117, and right away we realized that this, of course, would be very intense. We right away tried different strategies to see if we could do any movement without having to rely on grenades and explosions or anything like that, like shooting at the Marines or having Johnson carry us. We thought maybe they would run by and we could jump on them or something. It wasn't happening at all. We were really limited to not being able to walk, so we couldn't really maneuver ourselves. Now, of course, some rules we have with these types of videos is there are no walking at all allowed, and jumps on explosions can only be steered if you're falling a massive distance beyond just a regular jump or a regular explosion launch. So we're not allowed to just jump, press forward, land, and be like, oh look, we made progress without walking. That still feels like walking to us. So with us all stuck here in the beginning area of Sierra 117, we kind of tried to start getting creative with killing each other and seeing where the respawns were, but it seemed like every time we respawned, we would just respawn behind the person who had spawn priority. And in Halo 3, spawn priority kind of works in reverse order from what you would expect something like spawn priority to work. Whoever is the last player, or the player 4, or in this case player 3, is the player that the game will try to default players to spawn on. But if that player is dead, then it moves back to the next player. So in this case, if Dim was dead, it would move on to the Arbiter player. Still, we weren't having much luck with this because we kept just spawning behind the other players, and if anything, we were just kind of moving side sideways parallel to where we needed to go and not making any progress forward. So then came our grenade testing, and this is where we saw a glimmer of hope that maybe we could progress through this, and it definitely was interesting. Maybe not the most exciting thing, but as we tested out various grenade throws and respawns and more grenade throws and different types of grenades, we found that with a perfectly thrown grenade, if the player crouches at the right moment at the absolute height of a grenade explosion and the grenade was thrown correctly, you can move the slightest inch in a certain direction given all these variables line up at the same time. This was something we had to play around with for a long time before we even started moving, and by the time we had gotten out of that first crater, we were over the moon excited because we now were officially and visibly making a little bit of movement after 20 or 30 minutes of just trying to make the slightest moves whatsoever. Another really interesting thing that we started to learn in the process of inching our way ahead in Sierra 117 also was that if one of us die at the same time as the other player, there won't be a second spot for that player to spawn on the other player, and thus some of the times a player will spawn on the head of whoever has spawn priority. So for instance, in this case, there was a time where Luke and I died and I would respawn, but since Luke didn't have an open spot to respawn, the game actually would just drop him on top of Dim's head. Then with Dim repeatedly jumping with Luke on top, there was a chance at times that the top player will slide at a right angle and pinch the bottom player, and one of the two players, either the top one or the bottom, would get pushed forward a couple of inches, which, while it sounds overtly complicated, was something that would move us along a little bit further and a little bit faster than the slowest movement ever coming from these grenades. Seriously, the grenade throwing technique, we did start to get better at timing them and placing the grenades in the right place. However, even with us consistently hitting multiple of them in a row, we constantly were running into the problem where we just weren't moving very fast, which is just going to be a recurring theme here. And also you would run out of grenades, so then we would have to kill each other and make sure we were always killing the people who were the furthest in the back to keep the forward momentum going as much as possible, even though a lot of the times it didn't seem like we were going so far. So the push continued. We were just hanging out on stream, chatting for a long time while we were just throwing grenades at each other, trying to get into a system where we were moving slowly but surely. We eventually made our way all the way up to the log here, which was incredibly exciting, except we all died at the log because we weren't timing our grenades properly. So we were back at the beginning, and this is one of those challenges where we're just looking at the hypothetical if it's possible. We're not necessarily trying to overtly prove that we can do this in one life. So for the case of this challenge, we did allow soft checkpoints. So if we died or something like that, we did allow ourselves to walk back up to the point that we were at and the progress that we had made so far, and then we can continue our tedious adventure from there. At this point in our run, or not run, 38 minutes had elapsed before we finally were able to get over the log and land on the other side of the log. Seriously, this log was such a pain. We had to rely on trying to hopefully get pushed upwards or spawn on someone's head and then get rocked forward onto the log, and then continue to push forward until a player was able to drop down and we would finally bypass this log. So 40 minutes to get from here just to right here. Seriously, we knew this would take a long time, but maybe we didn't really anticipate it would be this slow of a process. But we definitely had been wanting to see if we could come up with a solution for Halo 3 for so long that it was more important of just figuring this out than maybe it would be for it actually being a viable run that anyone else in the world would ever want to try. I do have to say, we continue to refine and start to realize little things like where the best time to crouch was, what point of the explosion was the most efficient at pushing players, and also when to jump based off of when a grenade would explode played a big part in influencing the direction and amount of distance you could possibly get from a grenade. It was never a lot, but sometimes we were getting better at getting more consistent pushes that would give us an inch or two rather than throwing grenades, not moving multiple times, and then on the fourth or fifth grenade finally moving an inch. Now, of course, when you're moving along, sometimes the ground surface does play into your movement, and sometimes a decline in the terrain can be a really big deal. For instance, this section here, we got this massive speed boost of an extra 6 inches because we bounced off of the rock the right way, and literally it was just the most minor thing. But since it was so much further than any other distance we had gotten so far, we were celebrating like this was the biggest achievement of all time, and it was just like an extra free 6 inches that we got because we banked off of the rock the right way. But as we progressed, we got to the part of the level where it starts to curve a little bit, and for a short period of time, this theory that we had actually ended up working, where in Halo 3, for whatever reason, while we have the spawn priority set up, players will always spawn to what we're calling the south part of the map, or essentially you'll always respawn 180 degrees from the direction that you're facing at the beginning of the level. So because of this little curve here, there was this little section where we were able to respawn, and since it curves backwards a little bit, we were able to make a lot of motion just respawning because we were spawning to the south of the main respawn player, which was much faster than grenading, making a little bit more progress slowly but steadily. Of course, this section was short-lived. It definitely was only a short fraction of this one curve before we had to curve the other way and go back to the same old grenading, throwing, moving, grenading, throwing, moving. Seriously, this was absolutely awful. It just took so long. We were about 2 hours and 30 minutes into this run by the time we finally inched our way up to this waterfall section, which is the little water area right before you have your first encounter with enemies for the very first time in Halo 3. So at this point, we were committed for sure, but we knew this wouldn't be something that we were just going to easily throw together as a video in a day or something like that. This is going to be a process that's going to take a bit longer. So we continued our push up these rocks, which was a little bit intimidating, but surprisingly not as bad as we thought that it maybe would be, just getting up over this little section. And finally, we were able to fight off some grunts for the very first time, which was really exciting. Just getting that high action combat of not walking and just shooting a couple of enemies in the next area. And from there, we continued to push our way down the stream. But by the time we got to around these rocks, we were feeling pretty tired. We were about 3 hours into this run already. So we decided from here, we would mark a soft checkpoint and resume on another night, because we know Sierra 117 is definitely going to take an incredibly long time to make any more progress. So by the time we decided to revisit this, it had actually been a couple of weeks. We were just really busy with a ton of Halo Infinite stuff. So we were back at it, but this time we were prepared. We were ready to buckle in and finally beat this level once and for all. We actually brought a fourth person along this time, Covert Merchant, to just give us an extra set of grenades, and maybe having a fourth player would make the progress move along a little bit quicker. And the four of us decided to pick up right at those rocks where we had left off, and the progress was pretty much just as slow as we expected it to be. It was a lot of grenading and moving even slower than what we had finally gotten into the momentum of before, because a lot of the strategies that we had learned along the way we kind of forgotten, so we had to relearn the strategies a little bit early on. We really got caught up on these rocks right at the corner of the river for quite some time. For whatever reason, getting over these were just a real pain, and it definitely felt like we were slowly but surely creeping our way up through the forest in the slowest possible way that we could ever imagine. It was really exciting when we finally did make our way up to where the cave was, just because we had been watching that cave for so long, knowing that that was the objective, and slowly creeping up to it closer and closer. It felt really good to finally get inside of the cave. There was a moment though where we were all trying to respawn, and there wasn't a respawn point for Dim, and he clipped his head through the cave, which was about an hour into the run on this day, and it was just kind of funny to watch him get insta-killed by glitching through a cave wall. And for a very brief amount of time, we did get the southern respawn movement thing pop up again, which we were so hyped about for about 4 total feet before we had to turn again and things were back to normal. It also was kind of funny, multiple times Dim somehow managed to kill all 4 of us by throwing grenades right after someone else threw a grenade, and we were all losing our chill on him because he constantly would kill us all, and we'd have to go respawn, go back to our point that we were just at, and it was just this huge process. And yeah, we flamed Dim a little bit just for doing that. But I mean, he kept chaining grenades and killing us all, ruining the whole thing, and we were just losing our minds at that point. We pushed our way through the whole area that you have the sleeping grunts in, mostly by hugging the left side to avoid dropping down and falling down below. We did try riding on one of these boxes for a little bit, and you can shoot the box with a player standing on top of it, but with the weird angle that we were at, we ended up accidentally launching the box down below, which meant that this whole idea of riding a box to a glorious victory was probably not going to happen here. So we just continued our inch along the side ridge, slowly but surely moving up, moving into the area where some of the brutes were, picking them off whenever we could actually see them, and continue our grenading escapades. It was interesting, we could hear the Marine that's being held up by the brute from around the corner because the game triggered the whole sequence earlier, thinking that we would obviously be over there by now, even though we were still really far away. So that was kind of funny just to hear it from where we were standing. And then we got to the open room where you would typically see the brute holding up the Marine, but he wasn't there, obviously, because it had been so long. Now, we had two options here. We could either slowly grind our way all the way down to the bottom and wrap our way back up across and go across the bridge, or we could try to cheese a jump right here by stacking ourselves with the respawning trick and hopefully be able to scale this little rock wall. Now, this rock wall was a huge pain, but we felt like that was the more viable option. So even though we ended up spending quite a bit of time burnt into just trying to get the respawns on top of a player's head so we could slowly inch our way up this rock wall and time some well-placed grenade throws, we did eventually make our way up just to fall back down multiple times again. There were so many times where we would make it up to the top and fall down because we were just at the corner and we really couldn't control how much of a boost we were getting from the grenade throws. So a lot of the time we were just on the edge, and while one step would make a massive difference, we obviously can't use the walking stick. So we were stuck with just where we were, and we had to hope that we could get a well-placed grenade throw to launch things back. And if you jump at the right time, you could get launched backwards, but also jumping and not getting launched if the grenade was thrown poorly would result in you sliding right back down the hill again. So we had to be really careful, but eventually we did make our way up to the rocks here, and we pushed our way up a little bit further, but at this point we were about 2 hours and 30 or so minutes into this run, and we knew we still had a long ways to go. So we wrapped up night 2 of Sierra 117 here, already clocking in at 5.5 hours, and we were just maybe getting close to the halfway point in the level. So picking back up on Sierra 117, it definitely would be something we were very quickly learning wouldn't just be something we could just wrap up in one night. This is something that is incredibly tedious, and we decided it would be best spent if we did it across multiple nights, and maybe we would have to recruit some help from other friends as well. In total, we probably had about 7 different people helping out at various points of progression just to ultimately see if this level is in fact possible using the techniques that we had used so far. Remember, with these challenges, it's not so much about trying to prove we're the best Halo players without walking, as much as it's trying to test what's actually possible to do with certain constraints. So while sometimes we would be progressing past this cliff that we finally had gotten up onto, and we're making our way through this cave, which is a very tedious process, we all started collectively realizing that the biggest challenge in this isn't just the mental game that goes into being willing to sit in for hours and hours on end throwing grenades and watching respawns, but seriously, in general, we record all these videos pretty late at night, and there's probably at least one instance where everyone in this group was probably at some point very close to maybe falling asleep on Xbox just because of how grueling a lot of these sessions were, especially in the more than you would think sections where you just have nothing going on. Like, there's no enemies, it's just like a little area that you typically would walk through in a couple of seconds, and maybe there's a weird incline or maybe there's a weird rock in the way and you'd have to just maneuver around it in the worst way possible. We also quickly learned that along the way, things that we thought would be really difficult sometimes would be a walk in the park. Like, for instance, the whole area with the pelicans crashing and all that, we thought this would be pretty chaotic, but by the time we actually were able to inch our way over to where all the enemies are, a lot of the enemies were already taken out by the pelicans, so it wasn't like we had to do a lot of fighting. We ended up just getting a good respawn since this is technically faced in that quote-unquote south direction, so we're able to move along here. We finally got to a point where we could maybe grab a brute shot, which we were super excited to finally get to try, and when we got to where the brute shot was, because it had despawned in the short time from when we first saw it to where we were. So rest in peace here, but fortunately enough, this area wasn't the worst part. It was much faster than just the little cave area right before it. We would then be in a larger group when we got to the Jackal Sniper Forest, which was weird because part of it is in favor of respawning and then other parts twist and curve where it's not in favor. So there's a lot of back and forth trying different strategies, trying to see when the spawn points would line up with how we were trying to move and when we would have to do it the slowest and most tedious way possible. After the long time of just maneuvering our way through the Jackal Forest area, we then had this little dip and up dip that we had to go down and up through. This little uphill part was much more of a pain than maybe it would be obvious at first. And then one of the biggest roadblocks in this entire level was this area, because we had two options. We could either go underneath the bridge, wrap all the way around to where the crashed pelican is, and then try to make our way across the bridge without falling off or losing someone in the process, or we could try to discover a shortcut to jump up onto the rock and bypass the whole wraparound. We opted for going for the shortcut just because the process of going around would have taken multiple hours just to bring us around, and even if finding a shortcut took us 1 hour or more than that, it was still a faster method. So we ended up going for that. We had a couple of different ideas of what could end up working and where these jumps could end up working, and utilizing our quote-unquote soft checkpoint rule, meaning we're allowed to go back to a place that we had gotten to legitimately, did kind of bend the rules a little bit as far as what we were able to test. Now, none of these areas actually ended up being effective, and it was a pretty massive waste of time where we were trying to find a way to jump up without walking onto this cliff. It was just always a little bit too high, and even when we tried to manipulate the respawn so that we had an elite standing on top of another elite, it never really lined up the right way we needed it to, and it was just really frustrating. We really were trying to get down a lot of the respawn rules, like the spawn priority, to figure out who would respawn on who and predict it better, but a lot of the times we weren't in a tight enough place to make sure that the elites were constantly spawning on top of other players. So eventually, while we were testing this area, we decided to move up forward and test this other side, and we were making a little bit of progress. We even did allow ourselves to walk around for a minute to test which cliff actually was the shortest, and then once we realized that over in this side we actually could have an opportunity of getting up there, we then maneuvered our way over there in the most painstakingly slow process to that cliff and started trying to get one of us up on this cliff. In the process of it, we did manage to get a single respawn where one of the elites would stand on this rock, and while it wasn't the safest respawn, it was the start that got us all up onto this upper area in a bit of a safer way. It wasn't a fast process because we had to make sure we were respawning in the right directions, and it was very easy just to slide off the rock, as once I got up there, I pretty much fell down immediately, but we were able to get the respawn chain going and stay up there long enough to finally get out of this little area and progress in the level without having to go all the way around by the pelican and across the bridge. Fortunately enough, the little stretch leading up to the cutscene where you overlook the dam area wasn't all that bad. There is geometry set up kind of in this downward hill with rocks and grass that makes it really easy to bank down when you jump by crouching and hit random objects, which give you a lot more speed and momentum. So this was probably one of the most surprising sections that wasn't all that bad. And then from there, we had to drop down to the dam section, begin to make our way across. Now, we did notice right away that the respawns were not in our favor at the beginning, but if we could make our way across to where the main dam area is, we would have the respawn working with us at least for a little bit. So the main thing we were trying to do was just reach that upper area, and we had already decided ahead of time that we wanted to take the upper pathway, because ideally, if we could take the upper pathway, we might be able to use the respawning to bypass a large stretch of walking. So the upper path was our goal, and we slowly were trying to inch our way with grenades, and randomly and occasionally we had this brute just run at us with a gravity hammer and start swinging, and it was kind of hilarious, but also really aggravating at times. times because it would just launch us and we could lose our progress very easily. Eventually though, we did manage to get the brute to die nearby us with the gravity hammer, which ended up being by far the best weapon that we had been able to use in this no walk challenge that we had seen so far. We had tried out the brute shot a couple of times when we could get our hands on it, and it never really pushed us, whether we were trying to push ourselves or push each other, more than an inch or two. But the gravity hammer actually is really good if you hit the hammer off of the top of a jump. So that actually got us pretty far until it ran out of ammo and we were kind of stuck in this section. Getting up these stairs was definitely a pain. There was just so much that would keep happening where we would either die or we'd fall back down the stairs and we'd have to reset over and over and over again. But eventually getting up here, it was really satisfying because we could start doing the respawn chain across the bridge, which was really smooth actually. Moving across this bridge after clearing out some of the enemies wasn't all that bad, and we had the strategy set up that could possibly make the rest of this run significantly easier for ourselves later on. Essentially at the halfway point of the bridge, we decided that whoever had the lowest spawn priority would end up staying behind. In this case, it was me, as I was playing as the Master Chief, so I was the one that ended up having to stay behind here, where I would stand right here where the exit pelican arrives and ends up letting you leave the level. This way, when the rest of the group inches their way over to where Johnson is, we can quickly have them teleport back on me and we can all try to survive on this bridge together and hope for the best, and we could take off in the pelican. So I ended up staying behind, and it was up to the other three who were playing at that time. In this case, it was Dim, Vansha, and Luke to go ahead and continue on the quest. So they continued inching their way. They ended up, after a while though, starting to get a little bit creative with some of the objects that were available over in that area. They were trying out different boxes and carts that they could possibly all ride on to shoot at and inch their way slowly without actually having to walk or do the regular grenade respawn technique that we had been doing. So that was their strategy, and while it wasn't the fastest process, it did definitely beat the regular grenade respawning, hoping to be in the right direction technique we had been using so far. And this is something somewhat reassuring because we know later levels in Halo 3 are going to be really unforgiving in this front. So being able to use objects around, especially since there aren't very many more forest levels coming up, it could be a real big lifesaver on levels that might be harder than Sierra 117. So they continued to inch their way with the cart until finally they got all the way around to where Sergeant Johnson was. And fortunately enough, the direction that they had to go matched up with the respawning. So once they lined themselves up with the room, actually hitting the button to get Johnson out wasn't all that bad. The real clincher here was they had to very quickly kill themselves and respawn on me before the Phantoms flew in, making it too many enemies nearby to respawn, which they were able to do in time. And we all lined up right here and we were ready for our final stand, which honestly, these Phantoms come in hot. They drop a ton of enemies. It's very intimidating. You can die here. We just didn't want to have to deal with anyone dying after all of this time. So we ended up standing our ground, fighting it out, shooting the turrets off of the Phantoms and fighting all the enemies that dropped in. Then more enemies come in from the left, which they seemed to really take a long time, but they did eventually come in, which we ended up clearing out. And finally, that rescue pelican flew in and we were able to jump from the spot and hold the enter vehicle button. I was able to get in the vehicle, thus ending the level. And finally, after what may have taken significantly longer than 13 total hours across several different gaming sessions, we completed Sierra 117 without walking. But despite all of that and that entire process, we kind of realized in the process of thinking ahead that we'd be hitting a very big brick wall by the time we actually made our way to Crow's Nest, one that would pretty much make this whole entire run and series irrelevant, unless we can come up with a solution that we can continue working on and trying to complete in the future for maybe a follow-up video. Okay, but then we ran into a major problem with level 2, Crow's Nest, and this is where we're going to really have to rethink our strategies moving forward, because Crow's Nest puts a big roadblock in the way for everything that we had done so far with Sierra 117. On Crow's Nest, we immediately realized the run is dead in the sense of how it was so far, because you don't spawn with any weapons on this level at all. There's no grenades, no guns, and because of this, you also cannot melee or punch. So we can't walk, we can't punch, we can't do anything, just stand there, and essentially everything that we used as a tool in Sierra 117 makes this run dead right here, unless we decide to get a little creative with some of the skulls. Now, the only skull that actually could make a slight difference would be the Acrophobia skull. But if we just use the Acrophobia skull and fly through a level, it's not really that much of a challenge, is it? I mean, not in the same sense of where in Halo 2 we used the feather skull and launched ourselves, and there was this huge risk of falling to our deaths constantly, and it was a challenge to actually play through the game in that style. Acrophobia would maybe just make playing through the game even easier, not necessarily more challenging. But then we wondered if flying with Acrophobia is cheating for this type of challenge because you're moving forward. Would it be deemed acceptable, at least, if we only use the Acrophobia skull to heighten our jumps, nothing else? So for the sake of keeping this run alive or altering the rules so that we can still see what the rest of the Halo game is like and not just end the challenge after one level, we decided to see if the Acrophobia skull could do anything to alter something in this early section that still wouldn't break the rules or at least the spirit of the no walking run of Halo 3. So interestingly enough, I started playing around with the Acrophobia skull on Crow's Nest just to get a feel for what would be possible. Now, the one rule we really wanted to solidify is that we weren't going to allow ourselves to walk forward or fly forward in any instance. If we're going to use the Acrophobia skull, it has to be while we're looking directly straight up. We're only allowed to fly up and down, no altering our looking positions to move an inch or two or a foot or two, because that would just break the whole point of the game. Now, interestingly enough, I did find out that if I slam my face into the ceiling, I can lose health or even die at times, but if you're looking straight up, you just move straight up. And I think that this is fair here as long as we're only utilizing it for super jumping. We still have the problem though, with using the Acrophobia skull here, we aren't actually moving when we slam our head into the ceiling and back down again. But I did find after about 20 to 30 minutes of just testing going straight up and back down again and again on this level, that if you hit your face against the ceiling in the right way, you can actually get a slight bit of momentum. And it's in a way I never would have actually thought had I not just sat there testing it for all of that time. Essentially, you have to look straight up at the sky, slam your head into the ceiling, then come back down. Do not touch the ground. If you touch the ground, it's going to mess it all up. Then, after catching your jump before hitting the ground, immediately slam your face into the ceiling in the exact same point again. And sometimes there's a little bit of momentum that kicks in and it'll move your Spartan just an inch or two. And this, while extremely tedious, kind of fits exactly into the same playstyle that we had been playing through Halo 3 No Walk so far. So the run was kind of back on, even if it meant a newer set of rules here, where we found a way where we could slowly but surely move 1 inch at a time in this opening area. Now, the interesting thing about using the Acrophobia skull is that it's actually significantly harder to move than if we were doing it the old-fashioned grenade way, so that's interesting. It's just unique here that this Acrophobia skull is actually going to make this section of the level harder than if we would have just spawned in with a weapon and grenades at the beginning. So I slowly started to try to master this technique despite how hard it was. And there's all of these like different leveled textures on the ceiling that makes getting momentum to get over or around much more difficult, and a lot of luck is kind of involved in how you hit the slide and whether or not when you're coming back up to hit your head again, you're gonna hit the wrong corner. And if you hit the wrong corner, you end up sliding back quite a few feet, and it's tedious because then you have to go back inch by inch and push yourself back up to where you need to try to bypass the little dip in the ledge when you're hitting your head on the ceiling. You have to hope that you line it up just properly. But sure enough, after an hour or so in just slamming my face in this opening room, we were able to progress forward and make our way out of this room into the little hallway where we could get access to weapons. Even then, for the foreseeable next sections of the level, we don't get grenades, meaning the little bouncing tricks we had been using on Sierra 117 aren't possible here, which means we're going to have to completely rely on the Acrophobia skull to be the form of maneuvering through the rest of Crow's Nest. And with some of these tight hallways or these really weird ceilings in certain areas, this may end up being a significantly harder level than the one we faced off just a little while back with Sierra 117. But nonetheless, what else are we going to do with all our free time? This will just have to be another endeavor that we will try to continue through and see what's on the other side of Crow's Nest in the future. But Crow's Nest is a very, very long linear level, and even with us getting this far after this many hours, we still have an incredibly long way to go and a ton of different variables that are going to show up in each level of Halo 3 along the way, and it's going to be something that isn't just a quick summed up summary of how we got through this. This is going to be an individual challenge for each room of every level through Halo 3, and I'm kind of all for it. So if you want to witness our endeavors through this run moving forward, make sure you follow us on Twitch. There's a link in the description down below. Also subscribe with notifications on so you can watch these videos when they come out, and our other videos that we do in between these types of challenge videos, like our Halo 2 El Lasso, which stands for Legendary Literally All Skulls On, which has like 10 more skulls than the regular Halo 2 Lasso. It's incredibly difficult that we're also chipping away on and working on. So if you guys enjoy these videos, leave a comment with some advice on what you think we can do to get through some of the other levels. That helps tell the YouTube algorithm that you engaged with the video, and it sends the video out to more people and it supports our channel. So that'd be cool if you helped us out with that. That's it for today though. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.